Chapter 61. A Real Man. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Joseph quickly found the south hall of Versailles, headed up to the second floor, walked down the long, narrow corridor, and finally located the room indicated on the note. He tried the door. It was unlocked, so he pushed it open. "Is that you?" A woman's sultry voice drifted from the bedroom. "Close the door, please." Joseph shut the door, leaving it slightly ajar, and walked toward the voice. Pushing open the bedroom door, he found the room bathed in a soft, pink light. A woman, late 30s or maybe a little younger, reclined on a large white sofa. She wore a loosely draped gray robe over a sheer gauze, revealing pale skin and tousled hair. Hints of her figure played beneath the almost falling clothes in the dim light. The woman propped her cheek on her right hand, gazing at Joseph with a seductive look. She raised her left hand, beckoning him with a curled index finger, and said with a sugary smile, "Don't just stand there, come over here." Joseph frowned, confused, and held up the note. "Did you write this, madam?" The woman purred. Outside, the little fairy who had trailed Joseph arrived at the door, removing his mask to wipe away sweat. It was Louis Philippe, Duke of Chartres, eldest son of the Duke of Orleans. He peered through the crack in the door, catching the flickering pink light. Then, tiptoeing inside, he shifted the angle of the door to see Madame Semrin in all her alluring glory, along with the back of the crown prince. His heart leaped. He immediately understood what was happening. The Dauphin was hooking up with a knockout like Madame Semrin. No wonder he'd shown no interest in the girls at the ball. These secret rendezvous were why he'd slipped away. Afraid of being discovered, he quickly retreated. Inside the room, Joseph looked at Madame Semrin and asked, "What secret do you know?" The woman beckoned again, her voice husky. "Why don't you come closer? I want to whisper in your ear." Joseph frowned again, sensing something amiss. He decided to test his suspicions, so he said the secret code. "Odd turns to even." Madame Semrin blinked in surprise. Just to be sure, Joseph changed the question. "Chicken bro or concubine, which do you prefer?" "What is E equals MC squared?" Joseph's frown deepened. "I have things to do. If you don't tell me the so-called secret, I'm leaving." "No." Madame Semrin adjusted her position, sitting up a little straighter. She tilted her head and said with a smile, "I'll bet your secret is, you're still a virgin, aren't you?" Joseph sighed in relief. It seemed his alarm was unfounded. This was purely a seduction attempt, albeit a clumsy one. He shook his head and turned toward the door without hesitation. Not only was this older woman not his type, but his little body was still in the middle of puberty and she was a little past it. "Don't go." Madame Semrin hastily tried to cover herself again, but she only heard the thunk of the closing door. She almost questioned her entire existence. Looking down at herself, she saw no flaws. Any man should be unable to resist her. She'd confirmed it countless times. But the crown prince had only asked about chicken bro and MC, then left so quickly. He left. Little did she know, while her seductive techniques were top-notch for the time, Joseph had been raised on modern-day action movies. Her condition wasn't even good enough to be the subject of the film, so how could she make him lose his mind? As Joseph walked away, the Duke of Chartres stepped out from behind a pillar, frowning and estimating. He couldn't help but sneer. Is that all the crown prince can do? He was in there for maybe 3 minutes. What a loser. Turning to leave, he caught another glimpse of Madame Semrin's figure and swallowed hard. How could the Dauphin possibly satisfy her being that quick? The thought flashed through his mind, and a knowing smile spread across his face. Why don't I go in and show her what a real man is? The more he thought about it, the more pleased he became. After Madame Semrin experienced his endless glory, she would definitely be disappointed with the crown prince and maybe dump him. "Joseph, I'll let you know what it feels like to lose a lover." He smiled coldly, opened the door, and strode into the room. He was certain Madame Semrin wouldn't reject him. Even before the crown prince's popularity, he was the target of many young girls at the Palace of Versailles. Inside, Madame Semrin was still doubting herself. Hearing footsteps, she felt a surge of joy. The Crown Prince is still playing hard to get, isn't he? She let out a sultry sigh and was about to call out to the Crown Prince, but she was surprised to see the Duke of Chartres standing before her. Instinctively, she pulled the gauze closer. You! What are you doing here? The Duke of Chartres was already overwhelmed. He stepped forward, grabbing her hand. Panting heavily, he blurted out, Madame Semrin, you are like the stars in the sky, you have deeply attracted my eyes. And like the oak tree in the courtyard, deeply rooted in my heart. Madame Semrin had enough experience. After just a few words from this boy, she knew what he was thinking. She couldn't help but think of the Duke of Orleans' incredible wealth. Marrying his son would be a good choice. At the same time, she could repair her self-confidence that had been cracked by the Crown Prince. She gently stroked the boy's hair and said with a sweet smile, Really? Then you can prove it to me. The veil swirled in the room, and passion filled the watery night sky. Much later, the Duke of Chartres rubbed his aching back with a satisfied look. He stepped out of the room, pulled out his pocket watch, and glanced at it. He wore a very proud look. 44 minutes. Humph, Joseph can't compare to that. As long as I visit Madame Semrin a few more times, she will definitely lose interest in Joseph. In a lounge off the Hall of Mirrors, Joseph had changed out of his formal attire and into his usual clothes. Madame Verrill, dressed simply but elegantly, sat respectfully across from him. You're talking about the young man from the Davout family? She asked, surprised. You know him? Yes, Joseph said, nodding with a smile. Actually, I'm quite familiar with the Davout family. Madame Verrill nodded thoughtfully, never expecting the humble Davout family to be connected to the Crown Prince. Joseph continued, I asked you here to discuss Lieutenant Davout and the future of the Villars family. Half an hour later, Madame Verrill walked out of the lounge, took a deep breath, and nodded firmly, as if she had made a decision. This book is being promoted as a new release, which is very important for new authors. I urge readers to bookmark it, vote for recommendations, monthly votes, and leave comments. The young author would be grateful. Your support is the motivation for me to write. Reader Group 103-621-7580, everyone is welcome to join the group and chat and discuss together. Chapter 62 Mulan Infantry Regiment. You are listening at novelfull.audio. The next day, invitations had gone out to many Versailles nobles for a small dance at Madame Verrill's. No one complained about dancing again so soon. They were used to a month's worth of balls, but a party hosted by Madame Verrill was a rarity. It was widely known that the Duke of Villars was in a tight financial spot. By 9 that evening, the guests had arrived. After a few welcoming words from the hostess, the music began. The Duke of Villars, his daughter Mary Emily, and a young stranger took to the dance floor to lead the opening dance. A buzz went through the crowd as people whispered, wondering about the young man's identity. Madame Verrill, smiling broadly, quieted the room and announced her daughter's engagement to Louis André Davout, with a ceremony planned in 3 days. The announcement caused a stir. No one had ever heard of Davout. Soon, a nobleman learned about Davout from his valet. Rumor has it he's some small-time baron, a lieutenant in the Soissons regiment. Why would the Duke of Villars marry his daughter to him? I heard the Crown Prince thinks highly of Davout, but that's about it. That guy's one lucky dog. Madame Verrill offered no explanation, instead urging everyone to continue dancing. Meanwhile, in a room at Versailles, a young nobleman burst in, breathless. Throwing all decorum aside, he blurted out to Roche, the Duke of Villars is getting engaged. Roche jumped up, surprised. Engaged? Did she accept my father's proposal? No, no. It's to some lieutenant named Davout. Roche felt faint. He grabbed the man, demanding the source of the information, then stormed out. Across the hall, Emily, Duchess of Villars, smiled at André Davout as they danced. Their steps were perfectly synchronized, like butterflies flitting through a field. The whole thing felt like a dream. She had resigned herself to marrying someone she didn't love, but then last night, her mother announced the engagement to Davout. She couldn't help but remember their conversation. Lieutenant Davout is highly regarded by the Crown Prince. He's been transferred to the Prince's Guards as an officer, one of his most trusted men. Furthermore, His Highness said that if Davout distinguishes himself on the battlefield, he will ask the king to grant him the title of Viscount, or even Earl. But he doesn't have much money, and our family's finances. His Royal Highness guaranteed that Davout has a substantial sum, at least 50,000 livres. Her mother lowered her voice. Most importantly, His Highness believes Davout is exceptionally capable. If you marry him, His Highness will support him fully and help you reclaim everything that's rightfully yours from Noetta. Noetta was Emily's cousin. Although much of the Duke of Villars' ancestral land had been lost, he still owned dozens of hectares, real land, not just a title, with tenant farmers and feudal privileges. Not to mention the influence and sway he held in the Mulan Infantry Regiment. Although Emily was the only remaining heir and had little contact with the army, a call to arms in the Duke's name would surely be answered. Her cousin was already a major general thanks to the Villars name. It all made sense. Her mother would rather see her married to André than live under her cousin's charity, to restore the Duke of Villars' former glory. Across from Emily, André was also deep in thought. The Crown Prince had summoned him the previous night, informing him of the agreement with the Duke of Villars and his impending marriage to Emily. The Crown Prince had generously lent him 50,000 livres for the wedding and future expenses, interest-free and with no set repayment date. However, His Highness also assigned him a task, to help his future wife reclaim all the resources that rightfully belonged to the Duke of Villars, and then use the Mulan Infantry Regiment as the foundation for an elite army. Holding Emily's delicate hand, he was overwhelmed with happiness. He couldn't find the words to thank the Crown Prince. Perhaps building the Mulan Corps into an invincible force would be the ultimate reward. Louis XVI suddenly barged in, creating a scene like a clown. Vera, however, politely ushered him out. It was a happy day, and all disruptions would be handled with calm, no matter how disrespectful. André caught Louis XVI glaring back at him, but he ignored him, silently pointing to his boots. In the Dauphin's study, Fouché respectfully presented a roster to Joseph. Your Highness, these are the recently recruited members of the Police Intelligence Department, 176 in total. Fouché's eyes were bloodshot. He was running on only 4 hours of sleep while setting up the unit, but the feeling of power was exhilarating. Most of them have worked as royal police, and some are retired soldiers. As you instructed, I carefully screened them to ensure no serious criminal records or bad habits. Joseph opened the roster, which listed names, backgrounds, and areas of expertise. He couldn't possibly remember all these people, but it was a necessary ritual, proving he was the head of this intelligence agency. Joseph didn't know how Fouché had recruited so many people and formed an organization in a week, but letting him lead the police intelligence division was clearly the right call. He looked at Fouché and praised him. Your work has been very effective. You are an excellent manager. Tell me, when will the police intelligence unit be fully operational? Fouché replied without hesitation, right now, Your Highness. We can begin missions immediately. Joseph nodded with satisfaction. Your efficiency is impressive. There are 2 things I need you to investigate. Fouché took out a pen and paper, ready to take notes. Please give me your instructions, Your Highness. Joseph said, are you familiar with the former Paris police chief Guizot, and his alleged collusion with gang members to cause unrest in the Saint-Antoine district, including an attempt to attack the police station? Fouché nodded. Yes, I've heard about it. I believe there are others involved, but Guizot is taking all the blame. The first thing I want you to find out is who is behind Guizot and what their purpose is. Yes, Your Highness. Chapter 63 Gradually Leveraging Political Sectors. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Another thing, Mtlnovel and Mtlnovel recently tried to call in their government loans, which almost triggered a national debt default. Joseph looked at Fouché. Refusing loans would hurt these banks' profits, so there has to be another reason. I need to know what's going on. Fouché leaned forward. Understood. My people will investigate immediately. Also, Joseph added, here are a few things that might be helpful. When I wanted to join the financial system, the Duke of Orleans did everything he could to block me. Eventually, Her Majesty had to assign me to City Hall. Later, when I became assistant to the finance minister, Archbishop Bryant, worried about my lack of experience, wanted the Duke to handle all financial matters. But the Duke insisted I be responsible for government loans. And then the banks refused to lend, said one of Fouché's men, pausing in his note-taking. It looks like we need to take a closer look at the Duke of Orleans. He paused, eyeing the words Duke of Orleans on his notepad, and frowned slightly. Your Highness, the Duke of Orleans has a lot of influence. Right now, the Police Intelligence Department is part of the Police Bureau and limited to police authority. You know, a police officer can't interfere with royal palace matters. Go on. I think if the Police Intelligence Department could get some authority from the Royal Police, even just postal authority, we'd make much faster progress. Joseph gave him an approving look. He'd been considering the same thing, so he was pleased Fouché thought of it too. I'll see what I can do. He nodded to Fouché, then emphasized, but the Police Intelligence Department can't rely solely on authority to get information, and it can't just become a carbon copy of the Royal Police. The key is to develop strong intelligence skills and build a vast network. Fouché clutched his chest, bowing his head. Yes, Your Highness. That night, a large tent was set up on the lawn north of the Palace of Versailles. The sounds of bagpipes and accordions drifted through the air, mixed with laughter, creating a relaxed and peaceful atmosphere. It was an outdoor reception. Joseph disliked these events, usually just a breeding ground for gossip and dirty jokes. He made an appearance and quickly tried to leave, but Robert, head of the secret police, was there, so he stayed a bit longer. At a small table in the corner, Robert held his wine glass, looking troubled. Your Highness, there's no precedent for this kind of thing. I'm afraid this would have to go to a cabinet meeting. Joseph cut him off with a smile. Don't worry, I'll bring it up with the king and queen. Besides, the royal police aren't under the control of those cabinet ministers. He needed to inform the queen about something as important as setting up an intelligence agency. Otherwise, the two groups might cross paths during a mission and end up fighting each other. But, seeing Robert's hesitation, Joseph sighed inwardly. The secret police were Robert's power base. Even with the stock options from last time, it wasn't enough to get him to give up any authority. He had to pull out the bait he'd prepared. Count Robert, I've always felt the royal police have been treated unfairly. Robert was surprised. That was a loaded statement, and he wondered, what do you mean, Your Highness? Joseph said with conviction, the royal police are responsible for France's security and have made great contributions, but they're still just a small department under the Ministry of Police. That's just not right. I believe the royal police should have been independent long ago, a department alongside the police department, not even under the Home Secretary. The royal police are under the direct command of His Majesty. They shouldn't have to deal with internal affairs at all. At the time, French police and intelligence were intertwined, both under the internal affairs system. The intelligence system wouldn't be completely separate from the police until Napoleon's era, and sometimes the intelligence chief would also oversee the police. This restricted the secret police. As a department within the police, they couldn't be higher than the police chief. Robert's eyes lit up. If the secret police became independent, wouldn't his title change from state advisor to intelligence minister or security minister, allowing him to attend cabinet meetings? He quickly suppressed his excitement and asked, Does Your Highness's statement reflect the Queen's views, or? Joseph smiled. Oh, it's a consensus between Count Mono and me. Robert was surprised. The Interior Minister was nominally the secret police's direct superior. If he agreed to their independence, the resistance would be cut in half. With the Crown Prince's backing, the chances would be even better. He looked at Joseph cautiously. Did Count Mono promise Your Highness? Not yet. Joseph shook his head, but said firmly, I can guarantee he will agree. The secret police's funds came from the king's private account, outside the reach of internal affairs. It was useless to Mono. Many of Joseph's plans to increase revenue involved domestic affairs, real estate, public transportation, and so on. These were the interior minister's real interests. Joseph was sure that, faced with those benefits, Mono would happily give up a useless pot of money. Joseph planned to use these interests to maximize his leverage in the political arena. Robert narrowed his eyes. His years in intelligence told him the Crown Prince wasn't speaking casually. He hesitated, then raised his glass with a sincere smile. Your Highness, the police collect intelligence for France's security and to serve His Majesty. That aligns perfectly with the royal police's goals. I think we can work together and support each other in many ways. Joseph smiled. For example, by sharing some minor permissions. Exactly. Joseph lightly clinked his glass against Robert's. To the future Minister of Intelligence. British Ambassador to France Hartley finally received a reply from London. He opened the envelope with a letter opener, pulled out the code book he kept close, and carefully translated the letter. The letter covered a range of recent tasks, but the final 2 points caught his attention. First, to confirm the French Crown Prince's true feelings toward Britain and whether he was as pro-British as the rumors suggested. If so, make every effort to win him over and use him to influence France's policy toward Britain. Second, to increase the French Crown Prince's dislike of Prussia and encourage him to take a hard line. The French Crown Prince's rejection of Prussia was obvious. He'd once said at a cabinet meeting that there will be a war between France and Prussia. As Blue Star's troublemaker, how could Britain not stir things up? Chapter 64 Treaty of Eden. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Regarding the first item, Hartley had already been working on it for a while. Now, he's gotten instructions from London, basically, send more people to scout out what's going on with the French Crown Prince politically. Hartley figured that since the French Dauphin wasn't keen on building up the navy, he probably wasn't an England hater either. So, getting in good with him should be a priority. Word is, the French Crown Prince is a math whiz, too. Hartley decided to dispatch a scholar to make contact, ASAP. The second item was a real headache. Ever since Prussia pulled out of the Netherlands, they haven't exactly been buddy-buddy with France. He racked his brain trying to figure out a way to exploit that, but came up empty. Best he could do was spread rumors and badmouth them. Looks like for now, he'd just have to wait for a better opportunity. Hartley tucked away the secret letter, called a meeting with his team, and laid out all the directives. Bright and early the next morning, Joseph welcomed a special visitor, his former tutor, Mr. Lagrange, the math guru himself. Normally, Lagrange lectured in Versailles every other day. But Joseph had been running around like crazy lately, so they hadn't crossed paths. After the pleasantries, the old mathematician slid a fancy invitation over to Joseph, urging him to attend an academic conference in a couple of days. Basically, he really wanted him to be there. Joseph had already gotten 2 invitations from the French Mathematical Society, but he'd had to decline both because he was just too swamped. Lagrange had compiled and published Joseph's expanded Rawls theorem in a journal about 2 weeks ago. Now, he was a hot shot in French math circles. Plus, the Mathematical Society saw this as a chance to boost their own profile through the Crown Prince. So, they pulled out the big guns and sent Lagrange to personally invite him. With his old teacher making the ask, Joseph couldn't say no. He promised he'd be there. The following day, in the swanky mansion of the aristocratic widow Madame Josna, in the Saint-Germain district of Paris, dozens of math and physics brains stood to salute the Crown Prince. Back then, the lines between physics and math were pretty blurred. Physicists and mathematicians often hung out together. A representative from the Mathematical Society gave a rousing speech and formally introduced the Crown Prince before kicking off the conference. People took turns presenting, mostly on cutting-edge math topics. The atmosphere was pretty intense. After about an hour, the meeting transitioned into a more casual Q&A session. Servants started bringing out snacks and drinks, and the air filled with the aroma of food. Suddenly, everyone was chatting and laughing. The meeting had morphed into a math mixer. Joseph was about to make a run for it, but he saw his hostess, Mrs. Josna, fussing over him with some fancy black tea, then practically shoving him toward a prime spot. Having the crown prince there was a big deal for her. Joseph reluctantly sat down next to Lagrange, inhaled the tea, and listened to an old guy on his left ramble about a method he envisioned for deriving discrete probability distributions. After the old dude finished, there was a flurry of discussion. Joseph could kind of tell the scholar was hinting at something like Poisson distribution, but it was still half-baked. Wonder if Poisson's even born yet. Then, Lagrange stood up with a manuscript and started explaining some of his ideas about the connections between functions and their derivatives. After their deep dive into Rawls' theorem last time, he'd been focused on this, and he'd made some serious progress. Everyone was super impressed and got into a lively debate. After that, a few more scholars spoke. While they weren't as deep as the first two, most had interesting ideas and perspectives, which made for a pretty valuable academic exchange. Then, a young scholar in a dark gray jacket cleared his throat, snagging everyone's attention. He launched into a speech about the negative impact of Protestantism on science. Joseph was surprised and quietly asked Lagrange, only to find out that the guy wasn't a clergyman, but an assistant professor of physics at the University of Paris. After the young professor wrapped up, he got a round of applause. Except for a few people like Lagrange, everyone else was praising him or nodding in agreement. That's when the discussion started to go downhill. A short, stout, middle-aged man started ranting about British industrial espionage and how they were stealing French tech left and right. Apparently, it was costing France tens of millions of livres a year. Joseph frowned a little. There weren't any patent laws back then, so Britain and France swiping each other's tech was par for the course. But the fat guy's claim seemed off. France actually stole more from Britain. But bringing that up at an academic conference seemed a little out of place, but everyone else seemed to think it was fair game. They launched into full-on Brit-bashing mode, slinging insults and trash talk like it was going out of style. The brown-haired young guy behind Joseph started rattling off a history of France's academic dominance, accusing the British of ripping off French achievements one by one, and basically spitting venom at the British academic community. Someone yelled. The British can never outdo France in the world of science. Yeah, look at their dumb papers, saying light's a wave, haha. They always come up with that kind of nonsense and act all proud of it. Only France can push science forward. It's God's will. The French academic community was riding high, and with the ongoing feud between Britain and France, bashing the British had become politically correct. Has Britain ever produced a single great scholar? Nope. The brown-haired guy shouted, waving his hands. Then, he looked at Joseph, like he wanted backup, and leaned forward. Your Highness, don't you think so? Joseph sighed, shook his head, and quietly said, they had Newton. The room went silent, and dozens of eyes zeroed in on Joseph, like they couldn't believe the crown prince was sticking up for the British. Joseph thought for a second and stood up. The atmosphere and the arguments were really getting to him. Actually, Britain has a lot to offer in science. Besides Newton, you've all heard of Mr. Taylor, right? We use his Taylor series all the time to calculate trajectories. And Maclaughlin's structural geometry. Honestly, what steam engine might have an even bigger impact? The textile industry here in France is already feeling the squeeze. Speaking of textiles, some Englishman invented an automatic loom not too long ago. A middle-aged guy with bright eyes and a big nose whispered, Cartwright. Oh, right, Cartwright. Joseph nodded. If you combine that loom with a steam engine, it'll wipe out the textile industry worldwide. France has some amazing scholars and has accomplished some amazing academic feats. But we can't ignore the fact that the British have actually pulled ahead in several areas. He was trying to remind these French scholars that the Industrial Revolution was staring them right in the face, and the next tech explosion was coming. Steam engines and textile technology were areas they needed to focus on. They were the core pillars of the Industrial Revolution. If they got too caught up in France's past academic glory or got jealous of the British progress, they'd completely miss out on the Industrial Revolution. When he finished, the room went cold. Everyone seemed stuck between their pride and the reality of the situation. The big-nosed middle-aged guy came over to Joseph and whispered, Your Highness, you nailed it. I didn't realize you knew so much about Britain. Joseph smiled and nodded. The guy kept going. A few years ago, I looked into British industry and technology while I was negotiating trade between Britain and France. Like you said, they've gotten a jump on us in a lot of areas. It's a shame there aren't more people as knowledgeable as you. Most folks are still stuck in the past. Trade negotiations. Joseph looked at the guy. Who are you? Oh, wow, I'm so excited, I forgot my manners. I'm sorry. My name is Dupont, Pierre Dupont. That name rang a bell. Joseph immediately asked, did you help negotiate U.S. independence and run a chemical company? Yes, Your Highness, Dupont said, surprised. You know about me? Joseph nodded to himself. Turns out it was the famous industrialist Dupont. He wasn't expecting to run into him here. I've heard of you. The two started talking about the industrial scene in the UK, and the conversation quickly turned to the UK-France trade talks. Your Highness, since Count Vergennes died, our negotiations with the British have stalled, and the single tax plan hasn't gotten off the ground either, Dupont said, worried. The Treaty of Eden is really hurting France. The Treaty of Eden he was talking about was the trade deal signed the previous year. Both sides put limits on tariffs. France dropped tariffs on British manufactured goods, while the UK cut tariffs on French wine and some agricultural products. French industry was getting hammered because they didn't have tariff protection, and they were losing to the British who had better technology. The bump in sales of French wine and crops wasn't even close to making up for the huge losses in industry. Joseph nodded. That treaty was a mistake, and it's been disastrous for French industry. Chapter 65 The Dominator of Public Opinion, Please Vote for Me. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Dupont nodded, eyes gleaming with approval. Your Highness, this treaty is a disaster. Since those tariff cuts, textile mills in Lyon have been shutting down left and right, and our steel industry is on the ropes. We're talking about thousands of people out of work. As he spoke, officials from the Mathematical Society wrapped things up on stage, announcing the end of the meeting. Attendees respectfully cleared a path, giving the Crown Prince, the guest of honor, the right of way. Joseph said his goodbyes to Lagrange and the other scholars, then headed for the exit. Dupont hurried to catch up. After a moment's hesitation, he said, Your Highness, the British basically agreed to the single tax plan during the original negotiations. If we could get back to the table, France could likely get a much better deal. As president of the French Chamber of Commerce for northern France, and a major capitalist himself, the tariff reductions had hit Dupont hard. Seeing the Crown Prince, who knew the ins and outs of the British and French tech industries, was an opportunity he couldn't pass up. Even if there was only a slim chance, he had to push for renegotiation. Dupont had been involved in the original trade talks, and Joseph recalled from their earlier conversation that the key players were Count Vergennes, the foreign secretary, and Viscount Calonne, the finance minister. Now, one was dead and the other ousted over tax issues, which stalled the negotiations, leading to the compromised Eden Treaty. The Brits were cleaning up, and wouldn't be inclined to change the treaty. France's only play was to boost its own industry, get more competitive. Still, maybe they could squeeze out some minor concessions at the bargaining table. He stopped and said to Dupont, I'll bring it up at the next cabinet meeting. I'll see if we can get those talks going again. Dupont was ecstatic, bowing deeply. Your Highness, you're the savior of French industry. You're doing a great thing. As Joseph left Mrs. Josna's villa, a young man from the conference, head down, rushed past him as if lost in thought. Imang, quick on his feet, stopped him short. The young man, who had a long face, realized he'd nearly bumped into the Crown Prince. Flustered, he touched his chest and apologized. Oh, Your Highness, I'm so sorry. He spoke in English. Without thinking, Joseph replied in English, It's all right, no harm done. The long-faced young man smiled apologetically. Still speaking English, he said, You see, I'm from Birmingham. I just slipped into my native tongue. Joseph replied politely, Birmingham is a fine city. The young man smiled. Thank you for saying so. I enjoyed your speech earlier. You seem to admire Britain. Joseph assumed the guy was just trying to butter him up because he praised his hometown. Well, British industrial technology is very advanced. And they're good at international politics and diplomacy, innovative when it comes to cooking, and very pragmatic and frugal. A spark of excitement flashed in the young man's eyes, but before he could say more, Emang coughed pointedly, his face like stone. The long-faced young man forced a smile and bowed again. I won't keep you, Your Highness. Have a good day. He watched Joseph walk away, then jumped into his carriage and headed straight for the British embassy. You're saying, the French Crown Prince was speaking English to you? Hartley asked, surprised. Yes, Mr. Hartley. The young man said firmly. He's fluent and holds Britain in high regard. At the conference, he even publicly defended Britain against those who were critical. He then repeated Joseph's words verbatim. Hartley frowned thoughtfully. The French were hostile to Britain and didn't bother to learn English, especially not the royal family. Latin was their language of choice. A crown prince who spoke English was unusual. Everything was pointing to the same conclusion. The French crown prince was pro-British, or at least had a favorable impression of Britain. If Joseph knew what he was thinking, he'd laugh. He knew English because it was required for grad school. As for a favorable impression of Britain, get real. In his past life, he couldn't stand Britain and now spent his days scheming on how to outmaneuver France's biggest rival. Hartley drummed his fingers on the chair, deciding he needed to contact the French crown prince right away. He grabbed a pen and paper, wrote a letter, and asked his man to deliver it to a noblewoman at Versailles. Once his man was gone, Hartley remembered London's instructions to stir up trouble between Prussia and France. He ordered his carriage prepared, and set off for the Palais Royal. The Duke of Orleans frowned at the newspaper his butler had just brought. The French courier devoted 2 pages to the tax provisions of the bill the High Court had rejected. It explained, in simple terms, the reasons for the tax, who would pay it, and its potential impact on the country. Plus, there was a special report outlining the king's efforts to pass the bill, only mentioning that it was proposed by the former finance minister Calonne and rejected twice by the High Court. Clearly, there was more to the story. He picked up another newspaper with similar coverage. Archbishop Brienne is finally getting smarter. The Duke of Orleans smirked. Ever since Calonne proposed the new tax last year, the government had tried to force it through. After facing resistance, it started blindly compromising. They hadn't realized that they needed public support. The Chancellor was finally trying to drum up support in the press. To be honest, the new tax didn't affect the small nobles or commoners too much. Especially after the changes, it almost exclusively targeted the big nobles. If marketed right, it could win widespread approval. The Duke of Orleans tossed the newspaper aside, a look of disdain on his face. He and the banking giants were planning to use the rejection to push for Brienne's removal. He couldn't let him sway public opinion. Trying to pressure the High Court with newspaper publicity? Brienne's thinking is just too simple. He shook his head with a smile. After years of investment and influence, he controlled nearly half of the newspaper and pamphlet industries in Paris. Along with the papers owned by his noble allies, he nearly controlled the entire publishing and printing industry. His words were the direction of public opinion. He was the master of public opinion. Thanks to the Sin Boss here in the book title Sale Boss for generously tipping this book. Thank you very much Tian Haitian, okay. Chapter 66 The Story of the British Ambassador. You are listening at novelfull.audio. A black carriage pulled up in front of the royal palace. A guard immediately stepped forward, halting the carriage. Royal Palace. State your name. The driver produced a small copper badge and flashed it. The guard immediately opened the gate, lowered his head, and remained silent. The carriage proceeded directly to the east side of the palace and stopped. A man in a black robe, his face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat, hurried up the steps and entered the building with an air of familiarity. Inside, the Duke of Orleans sat at his desk, deep in thought. He was about to begin writing a letter when the butler announced from outside, "Sir, the British ambassador, Mr. Hartley, is here. Send him in." A moment later, Hartley, dressed in black, entered. He touched his chest in greeting to the Duke and said with a wide smile, "Philip, my old friend. It's been too long." The Duke of Orleans smiled and nodded. "David. What brings you to my door?" Hartley returned the pleasantries before cutting to the chase. "Philip, you know how London can be. Here in Paris, you're the only one I can count on, old friend. Just spit it out. I want to get something published in the papers." "Then you've come to the right place." The Duke smiled. "An advertisement? A notice?" "Well, to be precise," Hartley said, spreading his hands, "I want to run some stories." "Stories?" "Stories about Prussians." Hartley elaborated. "For example, Duke Schwartz of Prussia is competing with Count Felsen for Queen Mary's affections." "Duke Schwartz? I didn't know there was a—" The Duke of Orleans chuckled knowingly. "Ah, I see. It doesn't matter if there's a Duke Schwartz or not, the point is the story between him and his Austrian cousin." Hartley nodded. "You're a sharp one. And Baron Ramos of Silesia is having an affair with Princess Therese." Silesia was, at this time, part of Prussia. Princess Therese was the eldest daughter of Louis XVI and sister to Joseph. Of course, Hartley's story was completely fabricated, the Duke of Orleans casually added, and Baron Ramos's slave girl was spotted by the Dauphin during their rendezvous, and word is she's pregnant. Hartley's eyes lit up. "If you were a screenwriter, you'd be famous across Europe." "Perfect. Get that into the papers as soon as possible. These matters would touch on the reputation of the royal family. Without the Duke's connections, these types of stories would never see the light of day in the newspapers." The Duke of Orleans smiled faintly. "It's not exactly a walk in the park. That's why I'm imposing on you. Aren't you the one who calls the shots in the Paris newspapers?" The Duke of Orleans demurred. "That large sum I invested in the British automatic loom industry is still under review, you know." Hartley nodded. "I can grease those wheels. You know how those government officials are." The Duke of Orleans finally looked satisfied. "Then I'm counting on you. As for your stories, everyone will know them soon enough." Shortly after, Hartley departed, the Duke of Orleans immediately penned a letter to several major newspapers he controlled, mainly to coordinate their handling of the tax bill. He concluded by mentioning a few stories about the British ambassador. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Joseph's carriage left the Paris Police Academy, heading back to the Palace of Versailles. He now attended the Police Academy 2 or 3 times a week, focusing on elite courses like tactical command, military surveying and mapping, and logistics. He knew that the deepening industrial revolution would bring turmoil to the European continent, and that the redistribution of power between old and new interests would trigger continuous wars. He needed to master enough military knowledge to ensure France's security and stability. France was not the pushover it would become in later years, on the contrary, it was quite warlike. A king who could lead France to victory would be loved by all Frenchmen and wield supreme authority. Even if he didn't fight in person, he should at least know which battles were worth fighting and which weren't. Therefore, he had to learn basic military courses. He could also provide feedback to the military instructors at the academy. Military theories such as artillery and infantry coordination, cavalry artillery cover, concentrated artillery use, and deep penetrations were still in their infancy. While he couldn't teach them exhaustively, he had opened the instructors' eyes to a whole new world. By providing the concepts and general direction, they could continue to refine and improve them, adding them to the military training curriculum. Du Bois had arrived at the police academy a few days earlier to serve as the head of the Strategy and Tactics Research Office. He was surprised why a school training police officers would need to study strategy and tactics, but he readily accepted the position. After reading Joseph's advanced military theories, he completely understood the necessity of the research lab's existence. The military theory level of this police academy was definitely much higher than that of the Paris Military Academy. He was inwardly grateful for the Crown Prince's respect and his appointment to this military academy, or rather, this police academy, a police academy equipped with a large number of military horses, 3 4-pounders, and 1 8-pounder, Joseph sat in the bumpy carriage, thinking about the spring damping he hadn't had time to implement, and picked up the newspaper on the small table in front of him. The recent publicity about the tax reform bill had been very effective. In just a few days, he could already hear people discussing the new tax provisions on the streets of Paris. If this trend continued, the nobles and the Council of Nobles would soon find it difficult to incite public opinion against the royal family. However, when he saw the front page of City Voice, he frowned. He had subscribed to the paper for 3 months, but today's front page featured the rape and murder of a woman. He picked up Paris News instead. The front page headline read, "New Tax Bill, Mr. Bryan's Attempt to Increase Taxes at Will." Joseph's face darkened as he read the article. It was rambling and deceptive, portraying the tax bill as an arbitrary tax imposed by the royal family due to excessive squandering, which would have dire consequences. He slammed the newspaper onto the table. How could something like this get past the censors? What were those people doing? He immediately remembered that news censorship was under the jurisdiction of the High Court. The High Court wanted to fight the tax reform bill, so it was naturally turning a blind eye to these inflammatory articles. Joseph grabbed the French Courier. As expected, the front page read, "The High Court refuses to register. A victory for freedom." Chapter 67 Press Guild. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Joseph picked up the Citizen Daily again and started reading. The front page story claimed the new tax bill hadn't been properly vetted and was the brainchild of the former finance minister Carlona, warning of unforeseen consequences for France if it were enacted. The other newspapers echoed this sentiment, attacking the tax bill with all sorts of ridiculous arguments. Joseph couldn't help but think of the unscrupulous self-media of the future. You give them facts, they give you history. You talk history, they tug at your heartstrings, they throw around all sorts of nonsense. Avoiding any direct discussion of the issue, he read for some time, but only the new Paris News continued to publish an analysis of the tax bill. He checked the author and saw the signature Jean-Paul Marat. Joseph found it amusing. If this Marat was the same Marat who led the Jacobins during the Revolution, it would be ironic. The only one defending the royal tax bill was the future leader of the Jacobins, the most ruthless enemy of the royal family. By the time Joseph finished reading the newspapers, his face was grim. Overnight, articles supporting the tax bill had vanished. The entire newspaper industry had fallen in lockstep to attack the bill. Someone was pulling the strings, openly defying the royal family. The arrogance was unbelievable. Joseph glared at the newspapers, clenching his fists. They were just newspapers. If they wanted to play this game, they'd find out how strong royal power could be. He was so focused on the tax bill that he missed an article tucked away in the corner of the Citizen Journal. It was ostensibly a profile of the lives of the aristocrats at Versailles, but it subtly hinted at a possible affair between Queen Mary and a Prussian Duke Schwartz. The larger newspapers Joseph held were more restrained, but some tabloids ran articles outright suggesting scandals between Queen Marie, Princess Thales, and their Prussian lovers. Even more explicit pamphlets flooded the streets of Paris. These pamphlets were unique publications, circulated privately to avoid censorship, cheaply printed and priced. The pamphlets specialized in lowbrow content, enjoying a wide audience and outselling newspapers. Joseph originally wanted to go directly to Robert and discuss punishing the unscrupulous newspapers, but by the time he returned to Versailles, it was already after 9 in the evening. He had to suppress his anger and wait until morning. At the new Paris News office, a disheveled middle-aged man with deep laugh lines rushed into the editor's office with a newly printed copy. "Mr. Darmanin, why wasn't my analysis of the tax bill and its impact on the people published?" The editor-in-chief, wearing silver-rimmed glasses, looked up apologetically. "Mr. Marat, the Press Association requested it. They said publishing too many details of the bill might expose the court to too much outside interference." Marat exclaimed, "But it's a tax the French people have to pay. They have a right to know the details." The editor-in-chief shrugged. "I'm sorry, my hands are tied. I have to abide by the Press Association's regulations." Marat argued at length, but seeing the editor's firm stance, he left angrily. goodbye, Mr. Darmanin. Surely some newspaper will publish my article. The editor watched him go, shaking his head. That's impossible. The next day, Joseph had a quick breakfast and headed for the secret police headquarters. As he approached the door, he heard an angry young woman's voice from inside, the despicable, disgusting, obscene creeps. How could they make up such shameless lies? Seeing the crown prince arrive, the guard at the door bowed and opened the door for him. Joseph entered the office to find a young woman, slightly older than him, standing with her hands on her hips, glaring at Count Robert. She was petite, wearing a white, wide-sleeved dress. Her face was cherubic, her skin porcelain white, and her eyes a clear, sapphire blue. The name instantly came to Joseph, Marie-Therese. The eldest daughter of Louis XVI, Princess of France, and his sister. Joseph recalled that she'd been recovering at the Château de Meudon, which had a better environment. Why had she returned to Versailles? Therese heard footsteps and turned around. Seeing Joseph, she curtsied and then smiled. Joseph, my dear brother, it's so good to see you. It's been ages. Joseph returned the greeting. It has been a while. Dear sister, what brings you back? Are you feeling better? How could I stay away? Therese said seriously, it's those hateful rumors, they're making me miserable. Rumors? Joseph looked at Robert, surprised. Those tabloids, like the Courier and the Spectator. And the pamphlets. Seeing Joseph shake his head, Robert pulled out 2 newspapers from the table, turned them to a specific page, and glanced at Therese before handing them to Joseph. Joseph took the newspaper and quickly scanned it, frowning. Several articles hinted that a Prussian nobleman had recently arrived in Paris and was having an affair with the queen and princess. One even mentioned an affair with a brown-skinned slave girl. Therese said angrily, these shameless things started appearing in the papers the day before yesterday. I had to come back immediately. She looked at the head of the secret police. Count Robert, you heard what Her Majesty said. Those who spread these rumors must be severely punished. So, she had already complained to Queen Mary. Robert nodded. Yes, Your Highness, I sent someone to deal with it yesterday. Oh. Have those newspapers been shut down? Robert said quickly. No, Your Highness, that's impossible. However, we confiscated the printing plates of several newspapers, like the Paris Post-Courier, and fined them a large sum of money. Oh, and we arrested the editor of Le Monde, and he's currently being interrogated. Therese was dissatisfied. They insulted the royal family, and that's all they get. The head of the secret police said helplessly, Your Highness, there aren't any words explicitly insulting the royal family in their articles. I know the content is full of innuendo and could easily be misinterpreted, but the court won't find the newspapers at fault for that. Chapter 68 Control public opinion and use it for me. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Robert continued, Your Highness, shutting down the newspaper without the court's support will only make the royal family look worse. Remember a few years back, the whole freedom of the press thing? The royal police made some arrests, and the press went wild criticizing the family. His Majesty ended up letting everyone go. France is in a crazy spot right now. The nobles are egging on novelists and tabloid reporters to whip up these little stories about the royal family. As long as they don't get caught red-handed, they're in the clear. Watching the royal scandals has become a national pastime, but the second the royal family complains, they turn it into a huge drama and pile on the criticism. It all boils down to the royal family losing its voice in the public conversation. Seeing Theresa's silence, Robert added carefully, and Your Highness, shutting down a few papers won't fix anything. You close one, 2 more pop up, spreading the same rumors. Even if you shut them all down, like the old king tried, they'll just move to pamphlets. What Her Majesty the Queen wants is to try and get ahead of the situation. Of course, if we find hard evidence, those spreading the lies need to be punished. Like that Happy Man editor, we found a manuscript trashing the Queen in his office, so we arrested him. But the other papers, we just don't have the proof yet. Therese glared at him. Okay, maybe the papers don't have clear proof of insulting the family, but those pamphlets do, right? Dady told me they're full of insults aimed at me and my mother. So why haven't you arrested anyone? Robert looked pained. Your Highness, those pamphlets are cooked up by a couple of guys in a basement and printed in secret. They're tough to track down. Therese fell silent. She'd grown up hearing rumors about the king and queen, and they hardly ever stopped them. She knew if the secret police could nab those people, they would have already done it. Joseph frowned. He was there to get the secret police to go after the papers attacking the tax bill, but Robert's reminder showed him it was more complicated than that. The nobles were probably waiting for the royal family to overreact, so they could stir up public anger and tie the tax bill to royal abuse of power, making the situation even worse. The courts and the public would back each other up, and the nobles would hold on to the issue for dear life. No wonder Louis XVI didn't even get a chance to defend himself when he was getting slammed. Therese's eyes welled up. She gave Robert a small bow. Count Robert, I'm sorry. I shouldn't have snapped at you. It's not your fault. Robert said quickly, I understand your frustration, Your Highness. No need to apologize. Tears in her eyes, Therese picked up her chubby blue-gray Chartreux cat from the maid and walked out. Joseph wanted to comfort her but didn't know what to say. He wanted to raid those trashy newspapers, no matter the cost, but he knew it would be playing right into the nobles' hands. Like Robert said, you take down one paper, there'll be a dozen more waiting in the wings, and then there are the pamphlets. Even back in Louis XV's time, when they really cracked down on the press, journalists just set up newspaper offices behind bars. That's when liberal thinkers like Rousseau and Montesquieu really took off. France had embraced Enlightenment ideas, and freedom of speech was ingrained in people's minds. They couldn't just use brute force like before. Then it hit Joseph. Wait a second, why use force to control public opinion? Shouldn't I be trying to manage public opinion, to make it work for me? Not just shut it down. The thought sparked in his mind, and Joseph's eyes lit up, his mind racing. Therese's maid was passing by. He stopped her, whispering, Please tell my sister I'll make all those rumors disappear and make those who spread them apologize to her. A flicker of surprise crossed Dady's face. She figured the crown prince was just trying to make the princess feel better, but she nodded gratefully. Thank you, Your Highness. I'll tell her right away. Joseph said goodbye to Robert and headed for his room, already brainstorming ways to control public opinion. As a modern guy who'd seen countless online flame wars, he knew the power of having an audience. If you can reach 90% of the people while others only reach 10%, then your voice is the one that matters. Back then, the main ways people got their news were newspapers, books, and pamphlets. So how could he use those to build up his own audience, and fast? He immediately thought of how Jin Yong used his novel Swordsman to turn the struggling Ming Pao newspaper into a bestseller. 18th century folks didn't have a ton of entertainment, but they had their own weapons just as powerful as swordsmen. When it came to content, even if you combined every newspaper and publishing house in Europe, they wouldn't stand a chance. First, he'd need his own publication, and then he'd use high-quality content to crush the competition and quickly win over readers. He turned to Imang. Get me information on every newspaper and printing shop in Paris. The sooner, the better. Yes, Your Highness. Imang left, and Joseph started thinking about prices and distribution channels. Plans started forming in his mind, and he began to relax. A battle for public opinion? Bring it on. The royal family had been sidelined in the public conversation for too long. It was time to take it back. Before 3 p.m., Imang returned with a huge stack of documents and placed them respectfully in front of Joseph. It was information on all the newspaper offices in Paris. Newspapers had to register with the court, so the data wasn't confidential and easy to get. Joseph carefully went through the details of all 57 newspapers and the printing shops in Paris, finally settling on Paris business. It was a small paper with a circulation under 800, but it fit his needs perfectly. A big thank you to Beaver Crete, OxVK, Book Friends 20180510092102402466, and Yun Shang Yu Chu for your generous support of this book. Your encouragement keeps me going. I'm so grateful. Chapter 69 Competitive Advantage. please vote for me. You are listening at novelfull.audio. First off, Paris Business News isn't some fancy, old money publication. The owner is a self-made businessman from Marseille, inherited the business, and holds all the shares. Secondly, the paper's not exactly thriving. They've asked for tax breaks twice this year, so they're probably open to selling. Most importantly, Paris Business News has a huge printing operation. They've tried to print for other papers too, but it hasn't really taken off. Joseph knew right then, this was it. The quickest way to break into publishing was to buy an existing paper. He checked out a few options, but by the time he wrapped up, the sun was setting. First thing the next morning, Joseph headed straight to the Paris Business News office in the North District to talk about buying them out and check the place out for himself. The neighborhood wasn't exactly booming, but this huge building facing the river stood out. A Paris Business News sign hung above the front door. Even from a distance, you could hear the clatter and hustle inside. Out back, black wastewater poured into the river. Joseph started with a tour. The massive building was all printing presses, 7 of them. Craftsmen were pulling on the long, waist-high handles to press blank paper against the printing plates. A newspaper appeared each time the handle was pulled back up. Dozens of workers buzzed around, adding ink, drying pages, and moving things around. They were quick and precise, clearly pros who'd been doing this for ages. After seeing the warehouse and editing room, Joseph had a good feel for the place and was pretty happy with what he saw. He grabbed an editor and asked to speak with the owner. The editor led him to an office on the second floor and pointed to a stout, middle-aged guy in a dark green vest and glasses. That's Mr. Denico. Denico jumped up when he saw them, smiling and bowing. Welcome, gentlemen. Are you looking to advertise, or perhaps need something printed? Joseph cut to the chase, returning the bow. Mr. Denico, I'm interested in buying your newspaper. Denico flopped back in his chair, waving his hand dismissively. Beat it. I'm not selling. When Joseph didn't budge, he raised his voice. Get out of here. Or I'll have you thrown out. Joseph glanced at Imang, thinking, isn't this where you step in and say, insolent fool? Do you know who you're talking to? It's the Crown Prince. But Imang wasn't about to say anything. Joseph played along, pretending not to notice. Mind telling me why you're not selling? Denico mumbled, looking down. I promised my father I'd keep this paper going. Joseph breathed a sigh of relief, sat down in the chair across from him, and smiled. I'll give you 150,000 livres. And you can still run the paper. He brought his accountant, and they'd roughly figured out the paper was worth between 120,000 and 140,000 livres, mostly due to the real estate and the printing operation. Denico was stunned. The paper had been bleeding money for over a year. He'd figured he'd be lucky to get 100,000, but this kid was offering way more. He wrestled with himself but still shook his head. No. My father told me. Joseph nodded. 160,000 livres. But 170,000, final offer. A lump sum? Yes. Sir, are you sure, you want to buy my paper for 170,000 livres? Yes. Joseph nodded to the accountant, who showed Denico proof of the 170,000 livres in the bank. Denico stared into Joseph's eyes, making sure he wasn't joking. After a long struggle, his shoulders slumped, and he looked resigned. All right, fine. It's yours. He thought to himself, sorry, Dad, can't blame me. He's offering too much to pass up. Joseph's lawyer pulled out the contract he'd already prepared, and they both signed it. Then, the accountant and Denico went to the bank to sort out the payment. Banks weren't exactly speedy back then. And with that much money involved, the process took over 2 hours. It took 3 days for everything to clear. Denico had already found out from the accountant who Joseph was on the way to the bank, and he felt like he'd hit the jackpot. Not only had he gotten a huge payday, but he'd made friends with the Crown Prince. When he returned, he was all smiles and kept telling Joseph that he would run the paper for him, doing everything he could to make him proud. Joseph encouraged him and asked, how profitable was the paper before? Denico hesitated. Well, you know, people these days like reading gossip. It's tough for a paper like ours that focuses on freedom and ideals. We lost 1,200 livres this year, but I made a couple hundred in the first half of last year. He was worried the Crown Prince would have second thoughts, so he quickly added, actually, a few years ago, when things were good, I could make thousands of livres a year. Joseph nodded. I'll pay you a salary of 1,000 livres per year, plus a bonus of 5% of the paper's total profit. He was buying the paper to win the public opinion war. Paris business news would be his base of operations, so he needed to motivate the management and tie their success to the papers. Denico couldn't believe it. By selling the paper, he didn't have to worry about losses anymore. And now he was getting a huge salary on top of that. His Highness the Crown Prince was a godsend. He was so excited he pledged his loyalty, swearing he'd do everything he could to please the Crown Prince and make the paper profitable as soon as possible. Then Joseph said he wanted to raise the salaries of the paper's management and key technical craftsmen by 20%. Denico quickly tried to talk him out of it. Your Highness, the paper's still losing money. We shouldn't be spending that much more. Joseph smiled. The guy was conscientious and knew he needed to save money. Don't worry about it. Things will get better soon. Just do as I say. Joseph didn't dwell on the salary issue and got down to business. Mr. Denico, how many skilled panel makers do you have in the printing shop right now? Newspaper printing was still pretty primitive. They used lead type for the text, which was cheap enough, but any pictures needed to be done with copper plate engraving. A craftsman would carve the copper plate bit by bit and then set it in the press, or print it separately. Since engraving was so labor-intensive and time-consuming, it was also the most expensive part of the whole process. Denico answered right away. Your Highness, we have 5 craftsmen. 3 of them have over 10 years of experience and are well known in the coppersmiths' guild. Joseph nodded. Please get me some chalk slates. Good quality, cut to the size of a drawing board, and polished on one side. About 40 of them. Have the 3 craftsmen bring them to the Palace of Versailles. I have a job for them. Chalk was a common type of limestone. It was cheap and widely available as a building material. Denico looked surprised. Chalk. You want to fix the floor? Joseph smiled slightly, shook his head, and said, they're for lithographic printing. Denico's eyes widened. You mean, printing on stone? That's right. Joseph knew that if he wanted to crush the current publishing industry, great content wasn't enough. He had to attack from all sides, cost, distribution, and leave the other papers no chance to fight back. His newspaper was going to be so good that it would only cost 1 sou or even 8 deniers a copy. Theirs was ordinary and cost 4 sous. What were they even competing with? For cost control, lithographic printing was a game changer. Because the raw materials were so cheap and the plates were quick and easy to make, lithographic printing only cost 1/5 or even 1/10 of what copper plate printing did. Another way to cut costs was cheap paper, making paper from wood. If he could mass-produce that, he could drop the price of paper by 70%. Back in the day, this paper-making technology had triggered a revolution in the British newspaper industry. With those 2 technologies in his arsenal, Joseph was confident he could cut the price of newspapers to less than 1/5 of the current price and still make a profit. The cheap papermaking was tricky and he wasn't totally sure he could pull it off, but lithographic printing was simple enough. Experienced panel makers should be able to pick it up quickly. Joseph asked Denico about other things he wanted done in the near future, like hiring more people, stocking up on ink and paper, and designing a new newspaper layout called News and Pictures. After getting things in order at the paper, it was almost dusk. Before leaving, Joseph asked Denico casually, by the way, are there any big papermaking operations near Paris? Denico pointed northeast. There's one in the town of Saint-Antoine. Your Highness, half of the paper used in Paris comes from there. Chapter 70 Lithography. You are listening at novelfull.audio. To the west of Paris lies the Palace of Versailles, while the town of Saint-Antoine is to the northeast. Joseph, hating the bumpy carriage ride, opted to spend the night with the president of the Paris Chamber of Commerce instead of traveling back and forth. The next morning, we headed straight for Saint-Antoine. This small town just outside Paris was like a special economic zone, the only place around Paris untouched by the guilds. Craftsmen could find work here without having to join one, because they skipped the guild dues. The craftsmen were willing to work for a little less. This attracted a ton of workshops looking to cut costs. Over the years, Saint-Antoine had become home to thousands of craftsmen and their families. Joseph asked Imang to find a guide and spent the day inspecting several paper workshops, but he grew increasingly frustrated. The small workshops just weren't equipped to experiment with new papermaking techniques. The largest workshop, employing over 200 craftsmen, was sizable, but its owner, Louis XVI, wasn't interested in trying anything new. New technologies meant significant investment for trial production, and the results were uncertain. The risk was just too high. Joseph even briefly considered buying the workshop and starting his own operation, but he ultimately decided against it. Levaillant's workshop would cost at least 500,000 livres, and testing the cheap papermaking technology would require even more money. Joseph's recent spending spree had dwindled his fortune from over 2.3 million livres to a mere 700,000. Sinking it all into a paper workshop would leave him strapped for cash if he needed it elsewhere. So, after thinking it over carefully, Joseph realized he'd have to shelve the cheap papermaking idea until he had more money. This outcome was pretty much what he expected anyway. You can't revolutionize a massive industry like papermaking overnight. If the paper industry could be modernized and its improvements spread nationwide, it could give the French economy a serious boost. When Joseph returned to Versailles, 3 panel makers from the Paris Merchant newspaper office were waiting for him. He glanced at their heavy tool bags, the hammers of different sizes stuck in their belts, and then at the mirror-like marble floor of his bedroom. He quickly abandoned the idea of teaching them lithographic printing techniques there. Imang hurried in, bowed, and said, "Your Highness, the chalk slabs you ordered are still on the carriage. Where should we unload them?" Joseph frowned, thinking, it would be great if I had a workshop here. The thought of a workshop sparked an idea. He smiled and said to Imang, "Let's move everything to His Majesty the King's workshop." "Are you sure?" Imang looked surprised. "I'll go ask His Majesty." Joseph gestured to the 3 craftsmen. "Please, follow me." A little over 10 minutes later, in Louis XVI's well-equipped, spacious, and bright workshop, the King of France was eyeing the stone slabs and the roughly dressed craftsmen with curiosity. Joseph began by sincerely thanking his father for helping the French publishing industry. Then, turning to the 3 craftsmen, he said with utmost seriousness, "The technology I'm about to show you is incredibly important. It must not be disclosed to anyone without my permission, or else." He paused, choosing the most severe charge, and declared, "It will be considered treason." With the king and the dauphin present in the royal workshop and towering palace guards standing watch outside the door, the craftsmen were completely out of their element. They were so nervous their legs were shaking. They didn't dare lift their heads, swearing repeatedly never to breathe a word to anyone. Imang then presented the prepared confidentiality agreement, and each craftsman signed it. Joseph knew there were no patent laws back then, so this technology wouldn't stay secret forever. He was planning to popularize lithography throughout France eventually, but for now, it was his secret weapon, and he had to protect it. He would assign people to guard the 3 panel makers at all times, at least until he could control public opinion in Paris. With the confidentiality measures in place, Joseph formally began demonstrating lithographic printing. He had one of the craftsmen secure a polished chalk slab to the table. Then, he took the prepared printing ink and mixed in some paraffin wax and rosin. Once the additives were fully dissolved, Joseph dipped a brush into the ink and wrote "Salute to His Majesty the King" on the chalk slab. An hour later, when the ink was mostly dry, Joseph used a brush to apply dilute nitric acid twice to the slate. The areas covered in ink were unaffected, while the acid etched away a thin layer everywhere else. "The base plate is finished," Joseph said casually, wetting the slate and applying printing ink. he couldn't help but think back to the month he spent volunteering in the mountains, helping the principal use a mimeograph machine to print test papers for the kids. He never imagined those skills would come in handy here. The areas etched by the nitric acid absorbed water, repelling the ink, while the original dry ink was covered. Joseph placed a sheet of paper on the stone slab, pressed it gently, and carefully peeled it off. A line of words appeared on the paper, "Salute to His Majesty the King," but the letters were backwards. The three craftsmen exchanged glances, their eyes wide with shock. That simple line of text had taken only an hour from start to finish. This completely shattered their understanding of printing. Louis XVI watched with interest for a while, then asked casually, "Was there anything particularly special about the printing process?" Seeing the king's genuine curiosity, the oldest panel maker bowed nervously and explained, "Your Majesty, His Royal Highness the Crown Prince's technology is so revolutionary it could make all current printing methods obsolete." Another craftsman added excitedly, "We used to use copper plates. We had to cover the plate with wax, then place paper on top and use a stylus to carve out the parts we didn't want printed. The stylus would remove the wax under the paper. After finishing the design, we'd put the copper plate into ferric acid. The areas without wax would be etched away. Then, we'd take out the plate, wipe off the wax, and apply ink for printing. Just the wax engraving step took a long time, and etching the copper plate took over half a day. It usually took at least 2 or 3 days to complete one plate. But His Royal Highness the Crown Prince's method involves directly drawing the parts you do want printed, which is much easier than carving away the unnecessary parts. The new book has set sail. The young author is here to beg for monthly votes and recommendation votes. Everyone is welcome to leave comments. The young author is grateful.